just allowing the world to meet brilliance in braided form. And I just short kind of very
That was a bar. I'm sorry. Come on. Brilliance in braided form. Let's go. Hi, I'm Aaron,
And I'm Dr. Kia, and this is the Ratchet Roundtable podcast,
where we explore the defiant, irreverent, unapologetic ways that everyday folks get free
and thrive. On today's episode, we're talking to Dr. Angel Acosta, chair of the Acosta Institute, a bright star in the healing-centered education space, and a dear friend. Dr. Acosta's work bridges leadership, social justice, education, and mindfulness.
He is known for weaving conversations about inequality and healing into educational leadership development and exploring how tech can be used to dismantle structural inequality. Here's our conversation.
That hair is looking really good, Angel.
Yeah, you're like,
you gotta pull up fresh to the digital life,
I peep it.
I'm glad you did. So it's so good to have you here. Thank you. So welcome to Ratchet Roundtable. This is a space to get free, to be who you authentically are. We decided to do this podcast because we recognize that a key piece of human thriving is this sort of ratchet, joyful, loud, unapologetic, defiant energy that folks bring to living their lives and to the project of building a better future. We're really here to explore the ways that like we said, defiance, joy, getting loud, just refusing to be made small, refusing to play by the rules can create space for joy and liberation. And so one of the questions that we had was, does anything come to mind for you that you've seen or experienced that makes you think of this phenomenon?
Creating space for liberation, this
Yeah.
refusal, and immediately a lot of things come up. There's a colleague on Instagram. I'll search her for her name. I kind of randomly came across her. Um, I've been healing from social media for almost 9 years, and
Preach.
I finally like broke the back of the algorithm, in the sense that like what it feeds me is what I want to be fed. And so in a positive way, you could argue this positive way, most of the time when I'm scrolling on social media, it's almost like a micro learning experience because it feeds me things specifically across business, purpose-driven entrepreneurship, healing-centered education, artificial intelligence, and several other things that I'm really interested in. And as you know, Kia, we had a big conference on capacity building last December, and I guess the algorithm was listening, and it me this sister who's a renowned, or at least she seemed renowned, and I think she is, and she should be. Um, she has a whole page around capacity building in the context of mental health, and the first reel of hers just like boom, like kick to the chest. And then every other video was like bars. But she said, most of you are upset because you thought life was going to get easier. At some point, you all got deluded with this investment you made across your lifespan with the idea that life would become more easeful. But the truth is that life would get more easeful, but the reality is that you have to build the capacity to hold more ease in relationship to the reality that you will have to develop the capacity to hold more suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Most most of you are stuck on the reality that life will just become easy. But no, you have to build the capacity to hold more, both the ease and the suffering. I was just like, what? And there is a connection there between capacity building, building capacity to hold more, building capacity to just navigate these very complex, oftentimes treacherous times, and liberation. In fact, in terms of our tradition and in our shared lineage, it may be the the most enormous attempt to capacity build as a people is to achieve and arrive at our own freedom. So it's a tall order, but I'm really moved and inspired by the fact that it's been done before.
And I think part of what gets me excited is that I think when I hear the words capacity building in the sort of in the abstract, it's like, oh, build skills, practice, do more, get stronger. When I think about how it shows up in my life, the first person who came to mind for me, a couple of people came to mind. The first person was my sister, who has taught me so much about how to live with disability
Mm,
and really find a lot of joy and possibility in the world. And part of what's interesting about that is that she has, it's not like it was an easy journey, but she has continuously increased her capacity to be in the reality of what you have to grieve and mourn, and also to be in the reality of what is gorgeous and beautiful in the world, and I think kids play a huge role in this. So the other person who came to mind immediately was actually Sydney, even though we don't have to talk about Sydney because, we're on the podcast. But I was wondering because I feel like kids do ratchet stuff all the time. That's hilarious and amazing and like inspiring. So I was like, I wonder if Angel has a Sydney story that helps us think about getting free through ratchetness.
hmm hmm
Mm-hmm.
so many Sydney stories. My son. This morning we were playing around, and he just refuses to play by the rules. Like I was trying to play like TV anchor. We have a mic, a toy mic, and I was like formally interviewing him,
Mm-hmm.
and he was digging it. And like I was like, so what? What's the most important thing in life? And then he's like relaxing, and I was like, that's a good one. That's a good one. And then I was like, what's your favorite toy? And he's like, yeah, I forgot what he said. Then I did it on purpose to so he can learn how to anchor. So like I gave him the mic and I said, now
Mm-hmm.
you me. And he saw that that was like like a good move, but then he was like, nah, bro, like switch the rules to the game. When I asked him to interview me, he would would like babble. Basically, he would refuse to play uh,
Mm-hmm.
by the game. But in a way, like it's him kind of always playfully suggesting that he can make rules too when we play. When we play. But actually, when I love Sydney stories, but actually, the what came to mind was my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was just an OG in the family. Dominican grandmother. She died at 93. Had just such a life, bringing the entire family to the United States, and she was not just ratchet; she was also just vivacious. She was just so alive, and she did it by not just being a grandmother and all the other roles, but also as a host. Grandma's house is always like for many of us who have the relationships in place to be able to have a good relationship with our grandmother and be housed in such a way. Um, but the way that she held space for us, not just on holidays, but just anytime we were there, it was epic. Like this, just come be here, you know. And when there was a party, she'd be one of the last ones to leave, or the last ones to to transition, like 4, 3 in the morning, like in the Bronx. I have people who have visited my grandma's house during parties and have said this is the craziest party I've been to in my grandma's house. So there's something to like not just ratchetness, but also like building the capacity to just be in this society and hosting well.
I love that. I love that. I'm thinking about both of these stories between Sydney and your grandmother, and I'm thinking about my grandma who passed away last year, and am hearing stories from my mom about what growing up was like, particularly around the refusal. I'm thinking about Sydney's refusal, and then the story about your grandma. But I remember my mom saying, I don't know where they would be. They would be at some kind of public place, and then the Pledge of Allegiance would come up. Maybe it was like a baseball game or some kind of event, and everybody would, they say rise to, for the Pledge of Allegiance. And my mom is probably like 6 or 7 years old, and my grandma at the time had said, "Sit down. We're going to be sitting." And as a way of, and then I'm just finding out because they had grown up, or my mom had grown up in the Bay Area, which is where we're located right now. This is like Oakland, Richmond area, and my mom feeling really embarrassed by, okay, everybody else is standing up. Why do we have to sit down, right? But it was this ethic of refusal, right? And I even think about that kind of connecting to your story about your grandma, hosting these big parties where, it's welcome there in the Bronx, I imagine. And also when we think about kind of this respectability politic that shapes so much of how we live today, thinking about that as its own type of refusal is really kind of cool to hear, right? So, yeah, I love that.
That and joy builds capacity, and community connection builds capacity. When you talk about like building your capacity to hold,
Yeah.
That's easier for me because of these people and these relationships, including these people and these relationships in this digital room. It's easier for me when I have experienced the elation of listening to some music or dancing, like dancing. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier for me when I can release, right? So that, I really love all of this, the refusal and the joy in this question of like, okay, how are we helping each other not just survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
but but build toward this possibility for thriving. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah. There's something about hosting that's coming through, through my grandmother. There's a
Mhm.
wonderful article written by a colleague of mine, um, Adam Horowitz, and during the pandemic, he wrote this article called "Towards Building the Infrastructure for Sacred Hospitality."
Mm,
Mm.
mm,
Towards building the infrastructure for sacred hospitality, and it's a wonderful article. It's on Medium, I believe, um, and it really struck me to think about to think about hospitality on various scales. Not just like physical hosting, right? Like hosting, but also digital, right? Like we do so much of our work is on Zoom, right? So like, what does it mean to think about a sacred hospitality and infrastructure for it within the context of building community on like Mighty Networks or Zoom or Google Workplace, whatever, however we work in this hybrid um, workspace. Um, but then also the kind of infrastructure, the sacred infrastructure you almost gotta build to hold the world and where it is now. You almost have to, especially now when so many different systems are being questioned, dismantled, um, both not just politically but also even environmentally and ecologically with climate change and the ecological ways that um, just like we're really putting a lot of pressure on the planet. Um, but yeah, how are we hosting um, that world in us, and letting go and hospicing and surrendering. So it was a beautiful article um, that allows you to go a little deep around that concept.
It makes me also think about the people who keep me anchored, right, into loving myself more deeply, because I think the ways that we do that gives us hope for the future. And just about this concept of hosting and being a good host. I feel like good hosts also invite us to love ourselves more deeply, anchor into our joy, anchor into the things that bring us life. I'm curious, and this is for either of y'all. Who or what is something that is helping you love yourself more deeply through all of this change that we're going through? What or who is somebody who's kind of inviting you to love yourself more deeply in this time?
Hmm. There's so many. I'm just kind of scanning my office because there's so many books kind of peppered throughout. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Take us through the office journey.
I have a lot of books kind of laid out on the bookshelves and on the coffee table, and um, you know, this book I actually haven't read in years, and so it's a recent. Um, it's a re-edition. Um, and so I haven't, but he was somebody that allowed me to fall in love with um my mind in a way a long time ago when I was in grad school. So I'm sure there's different answers to that question, but just going visually with what I see first
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
Vaclav Vaclav Havel, who was the first president of the Czech Republic
Hmm.
right after
Mm.
Czechoslovakia became Czech Republic in the fall
Yep.
of the Soviet Union. He was a playwright in in the Czech Republic when it was under Soviet control, and pretty much lived in hiding, or at least in kind of home or house arrest for almost a decade, I think. And then he
Whoa.
wrote incredible plays. He was a philosopher as well, and the book is called Summer Meditations.
Hmm.
It's kind of a play somewhat on meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So it's grounded a lot in Stoic philosophy. But I mean, that book right now is a must read in terms of what does it mean to navigate repressive political landscapes and still be committed to certain ideals.
Mm.
So, I just remembered reading him in grad school and like just being blown away by how philosophy can bring you joy,
Hmm.
how philosophy just kind of I'd love to hear what you all think about uh philosophy, um and the love of wisdom, right? The evaluation of the world. But there's something to being able to deploy different frameworks to reinterpret like what's happening before us, and kind of there's a pleasure there for me, at least, alluding to Socrates' quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." But I think in that, it's not that not examining your life is not is not there's no pleasure there. Is that there's so much pleasure in examining your life that you're missing out. You're missing out if you don't do it. So yeah, that's what I would say. Just kind of riffing off of the question.
That's incredible.
Hmm.
I when you said I'd love to hear what you think about philosophy, I had like six thoughts at the same time. One was just that there is this beauty in coming to know, and this power in coming to know how you are and understand the world. And there's this beauty and power in coming to have language and concepts that help you interpret the world in a way that keeps you. I think in many ways it's so important that it's in ways that simultaneously keep you whole and keep you open, right? So to growth, to opportunities, to connection. And I was thinking about, we had Bio Akomolafe come and speak with us. Yeah, I know.
brother Bio. He's so generous.
Yes. And he
Absolutely.
broke my brain because we were talking about, containers and just sort of fundamentally what he invited us to remember is that the world that we're living inside of has been constructed in so many ways.
Hmm.
Our concept of humanity, our concept of society, our concept of even what the boundaries of the world are. And so when you said I'd like to, I'm interested in your thoughts on philosophy, my brain was like, oh no. Because bio had us both inside and outside at the same time. It was like, what do they call it? Schrodinger's, like
Cat.
podcast,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, like I don't know. So those are all my thoughts. But I wanted to come back to the beauty of you finding another person's writings and those helping you come to really love your own mind, right? Like to really just be like and love yourself, right? And by extension love yourself, and find joy in that. I, I think that can be, there's some ways in which I could interpret that as ratchet, as counter, I don't know if you had experienced things prior to that that made you feel like you shouldn't love your mind. Do you know what I mean? And that was so disruptive. Um, Anything that I think makes you love yourself, see yourself more clearly, really take anchor into yourself in a powerful and authentic way is really, really powerful in this world, especially when this is a world that tells you you shouldn't. I'm just curious if you want to elaborate on,
Yeah. Any thoughts
that.
on your end, Aaron? Anything present?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I was thinking is that we need a Ratchet Roundtable book list.
Yes.
So thank you,
Syllabus.
because we're going to be
Syllabus.
adding these to the book list.
Mhm.
And it was actually so around the philosophy piece. My mind was also going in a couple of different directions. One of which was thinking about, and Kia, you put me onto him, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and thinking about the relationship between theory and praxis. And uh, I mean, we've waxed poetic about this for I mean, probably hours in one way or another, but it's also made me think about, my own ethic of joy as praxis, finding things that are joyful as a way to get free. So for me, a lot of what that entails is movement. I love biking. I'm out here in Oakland. Got a whole bunch of roads that are paved, easy for me to, put my backpack on my back, have my speaker in tow, and just ride through the town and just feel the sun on my face, feel the rain on my face, and just exist, right? Just be. Referencing your framework, Kia. So yeah, I mean, that's somebody who's come to mind in terms of just helping me think a little bit more deeply about my own inner workings of my brain and what really brings me joy from that standpoint. Um, I'm also going to bring her up again, but Alexis Pauline Gums, I'm thinking about her short story. Can you also put me on? Thinking
Evidence.
about evidence, absolutely, and thinking about the world that we want to build and how a lot of that starts with us, right? We can't externally build the world that we want effectively without really, to your point, falling in love with our minds and what we are capable of, for ourselves. So that's coming to mind, and I'm sure other things are coming to mind. That other things are coming to mind. There are other authors that I can't name right now, but those two in particular, in terms of helping me think more philosophically about how I want to move through the world, uh, are top of mind for me.
Yeah. I mentioned Václav Havel because just visually responding to your question and kind of catching the book that arrived recently, and I had read that in grad school, um, and but there's a theme there around me connecting to writers who either are coming out of bondage
Mm,
or in repressive contexts. Not that other writers who aren't under those conditions haven't moved me, but
mm-hmm,
so, there's a direct connection between Havel and Frederick Douglass. Um,
mm-hmm.
in the lifespan of my intellectual development. Like Douglas was one of the first writers that I encountered during undergrad, like that first summer in college.
Mm-hmm.
Read, you know, his autobiography, and oof, you know,
Mm.
you can't read a slave narrative by Douglas and not be struck by not just the condensed suffering, but the the density in the writing and like the brilliance, the genius, um,
The
the
clarity, that
clarity,
clarity of
Mm.
thought, just
the and then there's so many other people like Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, and so many others that along the way, I just kind of collected, Dr. West, Cornel West, Bell Hooks, all of those classic thinkers, but they all have a relationship to coming from contexts where they had to fight,
Mm-hmm.
to not in a sense prove themselves dignified, but be luminous enough to break barriers and to
Mm-hmm.
stand upright in the face of white supremacy. And that's where I think being ratchet sometimes lends itself to a refusal. So it might be good for us to even think about, or for you to share what your definition of ratchetness is. I'd be curious to hear that. And I'll just say that at this point, you know, like I've been letting my hair grow last couple years, and it's really a grief practice for me.
mm,
Mm.
Honestly, the way that tending to my hair and letting it be um, has allowed me to just be with grief has been really unique.
Mm.
Also, see it as an extension of my ratchetness in the way that most of the times how I wear my hair in certain professional contexts, it rubs up against certain unwritten codes. I mean, some of them are written in certain states, but that
Mm.
I don't frequent those
mhm.
states. Um, so so yeah, there's so much more I can say about ratchetness and how I feel and how I move in the world. But sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's not so subtle.
I love that you're claiming that your very existence, you're simply existing in the world, is a form of disruption. And it's interesting to think about what it means to be embodying that disruption in an empowered way versus being someone who's finding, your existence disruptive to whatever, box or mythology they've decided that they're subscribing to. I think that is incredible, right? There are ways that our bodies, simply by existing, move counter to this sort of contrivance of a society and social rules that exist. And that is in and of itself powerful. And claiming that and loving your hair and being in your grief, honestly, right? Letting
Mm-hmm.
that grief be real and present and even sharing it. I remember I can't remember which event it was now, but I think it was one of the retreats last year at the Garrison Institute that y'all hosted, where you've talked about, you had an agenda, and your loss was so fresh. And it was just a moment where you said, honestly, I'm just going to keep it real. I'm mourning, my father and really feeling the weight of it. And just creating the space for that allowed all these other folks to say, you know what? Me too.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was space to be in the sorrow.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
was it was disruptive and it was powerful and it was healing. It was what people needed to heal. Everybody was there to do the healing work, but it was what was necessary in that moment. And I think, so I put our little definition of ratchet, which is, not strict, but in a lot of ways, I feel like that represents that being unapologetically whole.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I see over and over again how being in that in an embodied and present way allows other people to also be unapologetically whole.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it also falls into the that piece of it that's about being defiant of what tries to kill us or make us small or impossible, because failing to grieve is hard on us in our on our minds and our bodies, right? Not letting ourselves feel our feelings can actually shorten our lifespans, right? So it is a defiant thing to simply be real
Mhm.
about what you're feeling, what you're going through, and letting
Mm-hmm.
other people in.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Whew, I wish I was there. Sheesh. No, that sounds like a really powerful moment for real. We
Yeah.
don't talk about that, especially enough in professional context. Like, it's like clock into work, however you clock in, do the work, and there's really not and it our we grieve through bereavement time or sick time, and it's specifically coded in an HR system, and that can be helpful, and also it our grief is not just contained within, oh, I'm taking these 8 hours of whatever time is allotted to me, right? uh yeah, so I appreciate you just recalling that, because it makes us think about what's possible for how we can be in relationship with one another in all contexts.
Yeah. I like the definition around ratchetness being somewhat of kind of unapologetically whole, especially like in professional context. There's always this slicing and dicing of who we are. Like I'm here, I'm this person at work, and then I'm this person at home. Things have changed because the pandemic and remote work. I think people have to have maybe tried to be a little bit more whole,
Mm-hmm.
forced into that lately. But so much of professional life is a form of domestication.
Can you say more about that?
So much of professional life is a form of domestication. Uh, you know, confining oneself, and packing our identities into these specific units that get accepted, um,
Mm-hmm.
and get validated and get approved. So the way you move at work, or the way you dress, the way you speak, um, become like this almost like this domesticating of oneself. So that rawness,
Mm-hmm.
like that rawness, that ratchetness that comes from like my neighborhood, or my community in DR. Like I just came from DR, and um, there's just like it spills. Like you can't domesticate that. Like it's just like the flow is just it's just unstoppable. So I just think about the energy that it takes to just kind of fit in. And even just to make the connection to hair, for years, like I would keep my hair short, faded, seas, like nice,
Mm-hmm.
all lined up, and um, just like we landscape our golf courses, we trim and landscape our hair to meet
Mm-hmm.
the modes of production.
Mm-hmm.
And me letting my hair grow is also a refusal. Um, I'll probably cut it at some point, because sometimes it's a lot to manage. But for now, I'm gently holding that tension of just allowing the world to meet brilliance in braided form. And I just short, kind of very
That was a bar. I'm sorry. Come on. Brilliance in braided form. Let's go.
yeah. And I was just a quick story. I was in the airplane on the way to DR a couple weeks ago, and a Dominican brother next to me, and he was white presenting, and we had experienced some major turbulence. And him and I hadn't communicated. I was kind of in my own world when he came to sit down, and I actually took a nap, woke up, There was all this turbulence, so much so that it was causing a lot of concern throughout the cabin. And I grew up Catholic, so sometimes when it gets things get crazy, I'll I'll throw up just to get just to protect. I have a variety of different spiritual traditions that I appreciate, but that's the one that I was raised in, and I appreciate it. So I threw a couple of Hail Marys up there, and then I was cool. The plane was like a mess, but I was cool, and he's looking at me, kind of like he's throwing up 30 Hail Marys, and to the point where I kind of just I literally put my hand on his knee, and I said, "It's gonna be okay."
Mm.
It's gonna be okay. And I've been there before in turbulence, and I've done that to be like, just gonna be okay.
Mm.
And like a bond is made. And when things
Mm.
calm down, we just start talking. He's Dominican, I'm Dominican. We just start vibing, and it got so real that he said, "Man, when I was looking at you earlier with your braids, like I made some assumptions about who you were."
He verbalized that.
He verbalized that.
Oh wow.
Wow.
That's how that's what turbulence did. He verbalized you, man, and I was like, you got your braids, you probably have, just this particular flow, And when I told him I had a doctor, when I told him, he was like, bro, like that just like I'm sorry. And I was like, you don't need to apologize. You need to realize that brilliance comes in different packages, you know? So I kind of appreciate, at least for now, just showing up with my hair like this. Um, just to surprise people.
Mm.
Surprise.
I love that.
Love, love, love. I love that you said that's what turbulence did.
Make it rethink your whole life.
Yo,
Wait a
for
minute, we
real.
might die. What's really important? Oh, human connection.
Mhm. Mhm.
Brilliance in braided form. That's gonna be the title of this episode. And then we're gonna show you like
Well,
Yeah.
just really quickly, you all know like the rich history of braids and messaging,
yes.
right?
Absolutely.
The different freedom trails that were caused
Mm-hmm.
with particular braiding patterns, and um, I mean, freestyle braids just blows my mind. Somebody can just like look at your head and just like create all these patterns. It's just very rich, very rich.
Mm-hmm. We are not new to this.
Form of genius.
Mm-hmm.
This brings me back to what you said about how much energy it takes to fit in. You have all of this creative, unstoppable brilliance, and then you have to take that and repurpose it so that you can survive in this tiny, shitty little box. When you could be using it to just, create art on somebody's, crown,
Mm.
to design music that makes people feel more joyful, to, I don't know, play, you know,
Absolutely.
so much energy to fit into something that we didn't even create.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't by our design. And that's why we need to be ratchet.
Mm-hmm.
And for you, Kia, as a learning scientist, I don't know if the data has changed, but when I was doing research around education, one of the data sets that was coming out is that in the classroom, for example, teachers spend over like 60% of the time doing classroom management.
I mean, yeah.
Like data, and so I get curious about that. It's
Mm-hmm.
not it's and not just classroom management in terms of behavior, like child behavior, but also like classroom management in terms of policing
Mm-hmm.
and commanding students' attention in a very particular way. So I just all that energy, all that repressive energy, if it was kind of loosened a little bit, and I think that's what Ratchetdemic, the work of Emden and
Yep.
your work,
Mm-hmm.
that can we just come and be? There are guardrails for being with each other. But there's something that happens when there's a spaciousness
Yeah.
to be, and what happens with that energy.
Right. I think it's often in our relationships, we're making certain choices about the tenor of those relationships. And we can choose to sort of orient toward control, or we can choose to orient toward connection. And the two can't coexist. And I find this over and over again. Schooling in our country is carcerally designed, and often the people who move into schooling as a profession were good at existing in that context and have to some degree internalized that certain aspects of that, if not all aspects, have value. And so if we're not interrupted in doing so, we can then just bring that carceral logic into our classroom and think that the way, and if we don't have a liberation framework tied to the wholeness of young people, then we can come in and think, oh, my job here is to impart, this is back to Freire, and to control and to, corral. And, children's energy is wild. I will never stop thinking about one of my ninth grade students, who we're going to call Jay, had to get physical energy out of his body if he was going to be able to sit down long enough to do a sit down thing. And we figured this out early. So I made him a special pass that let him run laps around the school. And I told all the other adults, if you see Jay running, it's because he has a pass. He's running to get his energy out so he can come in and do this humanities lesson. And I just let them all know, like, if you see Jay and he's running around the school running laps, just leave him alone. He's going to come back to me, unless he's unsafe, like unless something, leave him alone. So they did. He had a special pass and he would come back. It was amazing. He'd come back and he'd come into the doorway and he'd be breathing. And I'd be like, you need to run more? Are you good? And he'd do like a bunch of pull-ups on the door frame and he'd either run some more or he'd come inside and sit down. And that was connection, right? Like, this is what you need. Let's just do that, instead of control, where I could have just punished him and punished him and punished him for not being able to do something because his body wasn't going to do it. And that's it. So you're right. Like, a lot of people come in and with that carceral logic of control, not recognizing that there are creative ways to just be in relationship and connection, and to empower young people to grow into developmentally being in a learning space together, right? Like, it's not perfect, but, and so there are teachers who struggle with that. There are teachers who don't, right? And those teachers who figure out how to be in partnership with their students around designing a learning environment that works for everyone, those folks don't have to expend all that energy on that, right? And I think that's powerful. It is truly powerful. I don't know if yes. Okay. I could talk about this forever, but thank you for bringing it up. Yeah, absolutely. It's always this choice between control and coercion, or connection and relationship. And we really do have to come to recognize that no matter where we are in any stage of our life, we are inherently divine and whole. And so this is why I love the Seek Sika approach that Cindy Blackstock articulated, which is essentially that, and Ryan Heavyhead talks about this, that we enter the world self-actualized. And the community's job is to help us, is to coax and nurture who we actually are into expression, essentially to create the container to hold us as we become, and to create enough spaciousness that we can become in an authentic and fully realized way. And when we do that, that creates the space. We're back to what happened in that retreat, Angel. That creates the space also for the community to self-actualize and to be whole. I'm about to cry. And that's ratchet as fuck.
Yeah. I just want to make just a moment for that, just a couple seconds. I really appreciate that. I have just one question. All answers are embraced. The one last question is, kind of considering what we talked about today, and maybe even something that you haven't articulated yet, but when you think about a vibrant, liberated future, What comes to mind for you?
You know, what comes to mind when I think about a vibrant and liberated future? Um, and I just asked the question out loud, um, because that's not the first response that I want to give you. Um, the first response I want to give you is not to the question, but to appreciate both of you for this conversation, what you're doing in the world, um, and just going to leave the community with some questions too, and you all for future conversations with future guests and between yourselves. Things like, what are the edges of this conversation? What are the areas of the epidemic that you may have not touched yet, and that are so awkwardly situated that we haven't touched. They're hard to touch. Um, what's unimaginable about this work? So as I think about a liberated future, I don't know. It's since so many things are changing right now in such a fast way, from politics to environment to technology with AI. Um, it's just a really weird time where categories are being suspended, alliances are being upended, treaties are being broken multilaterally.
Pluto.
So when it comes to the future, I'm tempted to suspend a commitment to having a fixed vision of it, and even to assume that it'll be better. Because even the notion of better is in a particular lineage of progress. So the future that I see is one in which we will have to learn how to hold paradox. A variety of paradoxes, actually, if paradox in plural form is paradoxes, or maybe some cool word like paradoxi.
Paradox.
But what does it mean to have super intelligence in the context of AI? I'm not talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence. This discourse is happening now around AI getting to the point where it's at the level of human intel. I'm talking about super intelligence. Super intelligence is AGI on steroids. And it's possible, and it will happen. What does it mean to have super intelligence with this infrastructure where that super intelligence or super intelligences can be expressed and yet have scarcity, environmental scarcity? So the future that I see is one in which we will have to be graceful with the reality that we may have created the perfect storm for ourselves. We may have impressed ourselves and acted like gods
Tower of Babel
in the creation of synthetic intelligence, but we may have really cornered ourselves with consuming the planet in a way that is beyond repair. And that's not to be gloomy, but it is to invite us that the future, a liberated future, is one that can live within its means. That's my response. So not like, so that's at the bare minimum, let's be decent. Let's be decent in the face of the kinds of polarity and paradoxes that we have to hold in the coming decades.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Things are
Makes me
changing.
decent.
How do we be gracious with one another? How do we be in community with one another in a way that is restorative, getting us ready for this new world that is unfolding?
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and I know we're coming up on our time, is this concept of intelligence. And I'm kind of coming back to the way that you bike, Aaron. So, assuming it's not the middle of the night, generally speaking, if you're not feeling very good, you get on your bike, and the intelligence is it's cellular, it's physiological, it's not from your neck up, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the part of you above your neck is going, I'm going to make the decision
Of
to get on
course.
the bike to go, but then there's this intelligence around recalibrating that is physiological. And I'm curious, Angel, when you think about sort of intelligence, whether they're, you're talking about that kind of the edges and the unimaginable. I'm curious about what you think of when you think of the concept of intelligence
Mm-hmm.
and our futures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much there, I'll just say, in light of, Ratchetdemic being a theme in the podcast, is there's a lot of wisdom in fugitivity.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Um, you know, not just contemporary conceptions of fugitivity like Fred Moten
I was just about, yep.
and many other like contemporary scholars talking about marunage, marooning,
Mm-hmm.
and and then going back to actual times of bondage in the African American context. But this idea of building fugitive spaces of learning, and there was a when I first thought about this, it felt intuitive, so I ran with it. Logically, at the moment, it was like it didn't make sense. But if you recall, Kia, one of the summits we did a few years ago was contemplating equity
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
fugitive futures.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when fugitive futures it hit me. I was like, why was the idea so permanent in my mind?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, and I listened. So when things come in, like sometimes an idea will come in and you'll try to like configure it in a way that it makes sense. Fugitive Futures didn't really make sense to me,
Mm-hmm.
even after we published that we were going to do this thing. It isn't until this conversation that it's clear is that when it comes to intelligence and the future, I think some of the most potent sources of it will come from fugitive spaces,
Mm-hmm.
spaces that will escape capture
Mm-hmm.
and domestication and
Mm-hmm.
control. And maybe from those spaces we'll get, um, if I may, salvation. I'm just kidding. No, I think there's just such a juicy thing that comes from alternative ways of seeing the world. And so that for me is the most powerful form of intelligence is that when you can cut against the grain and still survive,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
that's intelligence to me.
Yes. Ashe.
Where's your mic? You gotta like drop it on the table.
Right, right.
my pods, wait.
Hey.
That was powerful. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here, especially, when you're pooped out. It is always just an absolute delight to talk to you. And I always leave with more to think about. So thank you.
Yeah, same here.
Much appreciated. Thank you for being here.
I loved the story Angel told about his grandmother in this episode because there's so much related to thriving. She created abundant space for community and pleasure and relief. And that's like 4 of the 6 thriving dimensions right there. And I imagine when he talks about her, a woman who was really lively and warm and free and made it possible for others to show up the same way.
Yeah, 1,000% agree. I think I'm also thinking about when we heard Angel's story about his hair and the airplane meeting. We're claiming of his right to exist unapologetically, to be whole, if you will, it created spaciousness for somebody else's world to expand. And that's tapping into the selfhood, that's tapping into the community, the abundance dimensions of thriving. And relief was in there too, as they literally weathered that turbulence together.
That's right. They lived.
They lived.
He said, I got you. And as always, there's more in our episode, parties and books of philosophy, and even more than that. So, to the listeners, we want to know what thriving guidance you noticed, whether you're inspired to take action. Let us know. You can comment on YouTube.
Absolutely. And that's it for us today. This has been Ratchet Roundtable with Aaron and Dr. Kia. Stay defiant, stay free.